Hello, I'm Hilary Broad and I've been drawing and painting for as long as I can remember. Over the years, I've developed a number of techniques to save time and to improve the quality of my work. Today, I'm going to show you how to get interesting backgrounds without too much effort, then how to paint the foreground using homemade sponges and stencils. I work almost entirely from photographs, and here is the reference photograph for Whitby, East Cliff. So this picture was taken from the west side of the harbour, the quay side, looking across towards the Abbey. So my painting surface is plain white cotton sheeting, not polyester. And this piece measures 18 by 13 inches. I've started by soaking it in water, squeezing gently and spreading it out on a sheet of polythene. I'm using liquid paint. Actually, these are Iron Fix silk paints, and I've got 5 colours: ochre, brown, terracotta, black and yellow, and water in case I need to dilute any of the colours. So this is a large, soft watercolour brush, and I'm starting with ochre, get plenty of paint on the brush, and I make large, wide sweeps across my picture. Then I shall change to brown, and then terracotta. Getting quite a lot of paint on the brush, and you'll see how it spreads in the damp fabric. And you'll notice there's no sky in this scene. Of course, this is the background, and these colours represent distant buildings, rooftops, and other features. And I'm using black. It's very important for me to have a dark band across the middle of my picture. And this will be the background to the detailed buildings, which you'll see later. So lots of black in a big patch, but I'm going to soften the edges with some of the brown to give an idea of distance or perspective. One more black, and then I'm putting a shoreline at the bottom of my painting, which I shall do with yellow. And you'll notice that I haven't washed my brush at all. Well, they're my paints, and I can do what I like with them. And I'm going to put that to one side for a moment. Next, I'm going to transfer my painted fabric and polythene onto a former. So this is a piece of card that I folded concertina fashion, and you'll notice that the folds are closer together towards the sides of the card to suggest perspective. So here comes the painted fabric and polythene, and I'm going to make sure that they follow the contours of the card. And then I'm going to leave that for several hours, in fact probably overnight, to dry. So this has now been left for several hours to dry. So I'm going to peel away the fabric from the polythene. And there's the former, I'll move that as well. And surprisingly, the paint dries darkest along the ridges and palest in the furrows. And that's because the paint dries first along the ridges and draws pigment from the furrows. So that's now ready to iron and stick onto a piece of hardboard. So I've obtained a photographic enlargement of my scene to the required size. I said it was going to be effortless. I then trace the outline of each feature, rooftop or wall, onto clear acetate using a fine black pen. And I include all the windows in my drawing. But I make sure I leave about 1 centimetre of space between individual building outlines. And there I've completed every individual building outline. So here's my finished tracing on acetate. And next I use a sharp scalpel to cut my stencils. And I start with the windows. And then I cut the main piece of the building. This is a roof. And the reason I start with the windows is that if you cut that roof first, it would then be more difficult to cut the windows. So I'll do one more. Windows first. And then this is a wall. And that's actually a chimney of the house in front. And these are bits of tops of windows and you'll see what happens to them next. And I save all the inners, the buildings, but I discard the windows. So here are the finished stencils. And I've saved all the building outlines that I call inners, but I've discarded the windows. So these are the inners. So next I'm going to transfer the main features of my scene onto the background. So I cover the reverse of my enlargement with pale coloured pastel. Then position it as desired, and I'm just going to hold on to it rather than stick it, and trace down the main elements of my scene with a sharp pencil. I don't need to do them all because, of course, I've got the stencils, just a few important shapes. And best to get this right first time. So how are we getting on? Oh, fine. Oh, that's going to do. So there we are. So next we're going to paint our foreground using the stencils and homemade sponges. And this is how I make my sponges. This is domestic foam plastic or upholstery foam would do, and I make a little piece and stuff it into an empty lid from a lipstick. Then I've squeezed out some acrylic paint, so quite a lot of white, red, brown, yellow ochre, quite a bright yellow, and I'm going to add Payne's grey, or black would do, but I shall use Payne's grey. So now I'm going to position the stencil, and I'll start with a piece that's, I can see where that roof is going to be. I can see, and I should really stick that down with some tape. Just to keep that secure. So I'm going to paint this wall. So I get some white paint on the sponge. I start with an undercoat. Every element that I paint now, I start with a white undercoat in order to get the true value of the colour when I paint the top coat. So this is a wall, and I start in the middle and getting the right amount of paint on the sponge is crucial. Not too little, not too much. If it's too much, it squelches underneath the edge of the stencil. If it's too little, then it doesn't cover the ground. So that's the white undercoat, and then I'm going to let that dry for a few moments. So next I'm going to paint the top coat of that building, and I'm going to mix the colour, which is a pale biscuit colour. So mix some yellow, rather a lot. Rather too much. Can't start again. Bear in mind that acrylic paint tends to go darker when it dries. So we really do want a very pale version of this colour. So there we are, we've got it. And we're going to paint on top of the undercoat, and hopefully we'll get the right colour. And at this stage you can add a bit of shading. You can leave slightly darker patches with the background showing through to give you the effect of shading, or you can add shading afterwards with a grey mixture. And I think I'm going to add some lighter areas where the light is hitting the wall. And then I'm going to make up a shade colour. Do I dare? I won't need a lot of that. And I shall go back to the other sponge. So I'm using more than one sponge to blend and graduate colour as required. So, and then we let that dry for a few moments. So when the building is dry, and that's dry, I'm then going to add the windows. So I use the inner, and that sits in there, and that gives you the position of the windows. So I shall use some Payne's grey, perhaps with a little bit of another colour. And perhaps graduate it dark to light, top to bottom, or not. There we are. So that is where stenciling comes into its own, because you've done all that without a lot of effort. So next we're ready to paint a roof. So it's going to be that rooftop, and I'm going to position my stencil roof, leaving a gap, and that gap represents the shadow under the eaves, and I'm going to fasten that down with sellotape and start with the undercoat as before, we start with an undercoat so as to be sure we get the colour we want. Not too little, not too much. Start in the middle and work out, and then you won't be squelching it under the edge of the stencil. And here and there, thinking, well, we could have a bit of shadow, so leaving a little bit of shadow. And then we let that dry. So next we're going to do the top coat of that roof, and we're going to mix a nice bright red, possibly mixing some, no, not quite, and a bit of yellow. Lovely bright roofs in Whitby. So there we are, so that's red for the rooftop. Again, start in the middle so you're not squelching excess paint under the edge of the stencil. And we'll try not to make it absolutely uniform. So let's pick up another sponge with a bit of slightly different colour on it and get a bit of variety in that rooftop. And that is just so easy when you don't have to worry about the edge. Just take whatever colour you want, perhaps even a little fleck of light on that roof. And we've left a bit of shade down the side there. So next I'm going to add the windows in the roof lights on the roof of this building. So I'm going to take another clean sponge and mix just a little bit of the brown to get the colour of those windows. And that's all there is to it. So now we're going to add another roof, and as before I'm going to leave a little gap between the roof and the next building, and I'm going to start with my undercoat. Picked up a clean sponge, so I lost track of the previous one, and I'm holding the stencil firmly because I haven't fixed it with sellotape. And you can see why I left those centimetre spaces between individual features when I was making the stencil. I need a little bit of movement room. So then we leave that to dry for a few minutes. Next, I'm going to paint the top coat of that roof, and it's slightly lighter and brighter than the first one we painted. So let's see if we can get, oh dear, I do try not to waste paint, and that is a reason why I love painting with sponges and stencils, because it is so economical with paint. That is probably a little bit light, but as I've said, it does go darker as it dries. And again, I'm going to see if I can get slight variety of colour in there. Getting the right amount of paint on the sponge is key. Don't do as I do, do as I say. So we've got just a few little highlights there. Hopefully. There we are, we've got a slight graduation of colour. And we leave that to dry. So we're going to add the roof lights of this roof, and I'm using more or less undiluted Payne's grey there. And at a later stage I may add some window frames with a coloured pencil or other means. There we are, another rooftop. So we're going to do another building. It's going to be this white building in the front of our picture, and we'll position the stencil and pick up our white sponge. And again, I've left a bit of shadow between the wall and the roof. So that's the undercoat, and we'll let that dry before we do a second coat of white. So I'm now going to add the second coat, and it's going to be white again because this is a white building, although with acrylic paint it's never bright white. And I might add some shadows. Now you're going to say that's not pure white. I've got to, we'll go with it. And you can see why I need an undercoat, and that's come up a much better white with a second coat. And because I know there's some shadow in that corner, I'm just going to dab it into my Payne's grey just to get a bit of shadow. Around the edge of that building. And then we let that dry. So we're going to do the windows of this building. It's in the front of our picture. And I'm going to make them quite dark because they're closer to us. And that, if we make them dark, that will give the appearance of being a bit closer. And if you've looked at buildings from afar, generally the windows are dark. You can't see into the room, and unless they've got white curtains, which are closed too, the windows do look dark. Let's see what that's looking like. So one by one, I'm going to add the remaining buildings and other features to complete my picture of Whitby. So here's my finished painting, and you'll see that I've added some details in the window frame and the chimneys and chimney pots, and I even had to make a few more stencils of the surrounding buildings. So I hope you've enjoyed sharing my novel techniques. First for getting backgrounds with liquid paint, then adding the foreground in acrylics using hand-cut stencils and homemade sponges. I would like to thank my son Andrew for technical support throughout and hope to see you again soon.